Hello, everyone. Myself, Mohan Badu. I work for Fedora. I work on Fedora and CentOS Stream, and I'm here to kick off this open source club. Thanks everyone for joining remotely and as well as over here. I just want to ask Heidi to give like 2 minutes talk of what we are trying to do. And sorry, Heidi, for throwing under the bus, but it would be great if you can hear a couple of words from you.
Sure, no problem. Red Hat is nothing if not flexible. So my name's Heidi Dempsey. I'm the research director for the US at Red Hat. And we have a long-standing relationship with UMass Lowell and encouraging UMass Lowell students to collaborate with us, as well as faculty from the EE and CS departments. We have a good history of results and projects and sponsoring senior capstones. So it's an excellent research relationship and a good educational opportunity. I'm very excited to see an open source club starting and really enthusiastic about supporting students who are interested in that. And you'll see there's several other people from Red Hat joining this call because they're also interested in working with you. So congratulations for starting a new chapter. And I hope that we're able to continue this with lots of interesting projects in the future.
Thank you, Heidi. The first talk is from Justin Flory. He's an open source advocate, open source contributor. I've known him for years. He works for UNICEF, trying to promote open source culture and open source products. Just checking. Yep. Hey, Justin, do you want to take this?
Hey. Yeah, I can try to share my screen here. Okay, are you able to see my screen?
Nope. Okay.
Zoom says I am screen sharing, but.
And then it says there's
ever contributed to an open project. So I see a couple of hands in the room, a couple of thumbs up in the chat. Oh, a good bit of thumbs up here in the chat. Cool. And now, second question, how many of you have actively participated in an open community prior to hanging out with the Open Source Club here today? Again, I see a couple of hands here, lots of thumbs up. Awesome. Great. So for some of you, this might be a little bit familiar, but we'll be talking a lot more about some of the history behind open source, how to get involved, and we'll be looking at a specific case study, the Fedora project. But before we get much further, let's start from the beginning. Open source, what is it? Open source it's a method that we use to develop and distribute software. And it includes a set of best practices that make software and help build teams that make software. Open source is a movement. It's a movement based on ideals and philosophy that go beyond just code. And it's rooted in a belief that software has an impact greater than any one of us, and that there's certain freedoms that should be protected. And lastly, open source is a culture. It is a collection of people, values, and ideas that just so happen to take the form of software projects and communities. So what are we going to talk about today? We'll do a brief introduction into open source, and then we'll get into the origin story, the not so secret origin story to open source. We'll talk about how you can actually get involved in open source projects and what to look for when you're choosing a community. And we'll take a quick look at the Fedora project as one example of an open source community. But first, before we go into the agenda, just a little bit more about who I am. So my name is Justin. I've been involved in open source communities since 2013. So I've been doing open source for almost a third of my life, and I'm a contributor to various projects and communities around the web. I spend a lot of time talking about community management in open source in conferences and communities around the world. I also used to be a community moderator for opensource.com, where I published over 20 articles about open source community and best practices. Since June 2020, I currently work as a full-time independent contractor with UNICEF at their Office of Innovation. There, I work with the UNICEF Venture Fund as their first open source technical advisor. I work with different startup companies around the world that UNICEF is funding for areas of interest to UNICEF, and help provide coaching, guidance, and best practices to these startups on how to actually work as open source companies. So open source is something very dear and personal to me. But what we talked about, it's a method, it's a movement, it's a culture, but what is open source if we really take a deep look at it? So this is coming from the open source definition, which is a legal definition that's maintained by a nonprofit called the Open Source Initiative. We'll talk a little bit more about them in a little while. But open source software is software that can be freely used, modified, and shared in both modified and unmodified form by anyone. So there are some who use the term open source in relation to one or more of these, but a product isn't open source unless it includes all of these components, free to use, to remix and revise and share. Sometimes you'll also see this, you'll see open source referred to as FOSS, F-O-S-S, which is for free and open source software. And this free is referring to free as in speech, not just as in pizza or beer. So usually it means that the source code is publicly available for reading, use, and modification. However, FOSS is also more than just software. It's development practices, it's licensing, it's communities, all of these things that help build software together. And oftentimes, FOSS projects have a shared set of common values. So I'm sure some of you recognize at least some of the logos, if not all the logos on the screen. But this is just really to drive home that open source is everywhere today. It's in your pocket. It's in the room you're in right now. It's powering the internet. It's all around us. And here on the screen, you can see that from government and NGOs to private sector companies to open source projects, and even some hardware companies and projects here as well. But to look at this from another perspective, in 2014, there was a public study done on what operating systems exist or are being used across across the internet on public servers. And it was found that just about 80% of those were running Linux or a Unix-based derivative, which Linux being an all open source and free and open source operating system, that's pretty huge, especially back for for 8 years ago. I'm not sure, there might be more recent data on this now today. I'd be really interested to see that too. But I always think this is really interesting to look at. Even 8 years ago, Linux was already a huge part of open source infrastructure. And just to point out, of course, there's more than just Linux and operating systems, but oftentimes on these Linux or web servers, you'll be running open source frameworks and tools like JavaScript or Node.js, or you'll be having a web server or a web development framework. So all these pieces also can fit on top of that as well. Another example, thinking about what's probably around you right now or in your pocket or in the room. I'm sure you're probably familiar with Google's Android. Its base version is a free and open source operating system that Google develops. And then people can build on top of that, like the different manufacturers do. Firefox is another really well-known one, the web browser, as well as LibreOffice, an open source Microsoft Office. But also, if we look at it from a programming language perspective, we see the same trend here. And this one's across a number of different actors, from the Python Software Foundation, who stewards and maintains the Python programming language, to Microsoft, who in the last decade open sourced the .NET programming language. And even Apple's in on the game with their Swift programming language. All three of these you can find fully available as open source, and there's a community of people working around these languages. I just like this example a lot because you really get the diversity of the kind of folks who are involved in the open source ecosystem here on the programming language side. So if this is a little bit on where open source is, why do people open source things? Like, why is this an advantage for a project? There's many different ways you could frame it, but we'll look at it from 4 different perspectives. On control, that it's always possible to study and understand how something works. Nobody can tell you what or how to use the software. It can also be helpful around training, that learning happens in the public and you have a connection to a wider ecosystem than you would beyond just a closed source work. And it's also easier to get faster feedback. There's also a security perspective. It's easier to audit open works, and it's often quicker to fix problems due to the nature of having more eyes on a problem, which I'll mention here again in just a second. And finally, stability. That it's possible for you to build on open, common standards that improve interoperability, working among different projects, but using common standards between those. Additionally, it's also easier to fork or copy a project and continue it on if it's needed. So on that security side of things, sometimes you might hear about Linus's law, which is referring to Linus Torvalds, the creator of Linux. But generally, it's that given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. So that's a little bit of a quick introduction on all things open source. But now let's go a little bit deeper and actually think about the origin story, and also how we got to be where we are today and to this room in 2022, and why we're talking about open source now. So let's go in from the very beginning of where the open source, or truly the free software movement, began. So the common origin of free software is usually cited to 1983. Marked by the creation of the GNU project by a developer at MIT called Richard Stallman. So this was the beginning of the free culture movement, which had already existed before software, but it's the free culture movement as it applies to software and technology. So at the time in the late 70s and early 80s, Richard Stallman was research faculty at the MIT Media Lab. And he lived to this really unique period of open access to software by default. So way back in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, people just didn't care about software. I mean, they cared about software, but not in a financial sense. Software, because at the time, we had so many different hardware architectures and everyone was writing software, and you might use it for one architecture, but it won't compile on another one. So people didn't really care about software as much because it was more about hardware at the time. But suddenly, in the 1980s, we start to standardize on hardware architecture. Intel does their CPU architectures and starts to bring more unity, and a lot of architectures go away around this time. And suddenly, software, there was this commercial market shift to software from hardware. And this was a paradigm shift in how software was used and distributed. So anyways, Richard Stallman was observing this and saw this happen, and how people even he worked with at MIT were being hired by these private sector companies and writing closed source software where they wouldn't share anything back with other people. And he felt this was wrong and that there were certain freedoms that needed to be respected. So if you're Richard Stallman and it's 1983, how do you act on these things? You define your values and you build an open source operating system. And that's what the GNU project was. If we go to 1985, a couple years later, we see the launch of the Free Software Foundation, a US nonprofit. This was founded in part by Richard Stallman to help sustain the efforts on the GNU operating system. But it's since that time, it's shifted away from focusing on development to other different areas of the free culture movement outside of just writing code. But the significant thing here is that the FSF in 1985 is the first significant institution to protect and embrace free software. To that end, 4 years after the FSF is launched, we come to 1989, which is the first version of the GNU public license. The GPL is released. This was a license drafted by the Free Software Foundation. And while it's not the first open source license, it is the first of its kind. It introduces a new concept to open source licenses called copyleft, meaning that if you take a derivative work or an open source work, you can't change the license or make the code proprietary later. So this marked a significant shift in the perspective on the way software is developed and how we distribute and share it with each other. And so this was 1989. Just 2 years later, the GPL drafts version 2, which is released in 1991. And not that long after, the Linux kernel comes along, which is one of the earliest open source projects as we know it today. And it was also an early adopter of the GPL. Across the 90s, the Linux kernel development practices shaped a decade of the free culture movement inside the tech world. And so this is really where we see some of these concepts and these licenses really start to get more recognition and more visibility. To that end, if we skip ahead 6 years, we'll arrive at 1997, which a lot of people will mark by the publication of this book called The Cathedral and the Bazaar. So this is really the changing point where open source starts to go mainstream. And this international breakthrough is starting to happen, and it's partially marked by the publication of this book. So the author is using it to describe 2 significantly different ways of developing software, where the cathedral is this closed and proprietary software development, very procedural process, and this bazaar is this open and free software development model that, as Eric Raymond writes here, rather the Linux communities seem to resemble a great babbling bazaar of differing agendas and approaches, out of which a coherent and stable system could seemingly emerge. However, in 1997, we have one critical problem here, is that the business world, when you go and say free software, you say the word free, people get really scared and really uncomfortable. And they don't think of free as in freedom. They're thinking of a very different kind of free. So how do you translate these kinds of things? Like, how can you have a sustainable, financially sustainable, free and open source project? Well, this is partly the role of the Open Source Initiative that's founded in 1998. And in a way, they act as a liaison between the free culture movement and the business world. At the very beginning, their role was almost to convince the business world that free does not necessarily mean no bottom line. And it's also around 1998, we see the first usages of the term open source software emerge. Previous to 1998, it was all free software, but now we see that term open source really break in as the word and phrase we all know today. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our history lesson here, but why does this history actually matter? Like, why am I telling you all these things? This was all in the 20th century. Why does it matter today? Well, the same conversations are still happening in the 2020s as we had in the 1980s and the 1990s. So in order for us to understand how open source has changed since then, first, we have to be really clear on the core essence of what open source is, which you can go back and look at that open source definition I shared at the beginning. But I like to remember the 4 R's as a helpful way of really remembering what open source is all about. So you have these 4 freedoms of open source, and these are the 4 essential principles. These are the rules, and you cannot change these things with any open source project. So you can remember it as the 4 R's, the freedom to read. You have the ability to see how something works and study the source. You have the freedom to run it or use it any way you wish. There's no restrictions on how you have to use the software. You can revise it, make changes. You're always allowed to make changes to the software. And finally, you have the freedom to redistribute or share your changes with other people. So if these are the 4 core freedoms of free and open source software, how has open source changed since these last 40 years? Just to point out this, I love to show this quote from Microsoft in 2001. I think this is from Jim Alchin. I think was the senior vice president of engineering, some high up person at Microsoft, saying, "Open source is an intellectual property destroyer. I can't imagine something worse than this for software and intellectual property." Like, okay, wow, don't mince your words, Jim. So not at all favorable of open source at all. And you can probably find other parts of Microsoft calling open source and Linux a cancer. I think Steve Ballmer said that. But so this was 2001. Let's fast forward 14 years and whoa, it's 2015. And Satya Nadella's here on a blog post, Microsoft officially in love with open source. Microsoft has been working with open source for over 10 years already. The company has already declared its love for Linux. We have 140 working groups dealing with open standards and over 400 projects where code is written before given back to the community. 14 years could change a lot. But hold on here. We haven't even gotten to the main event of this show yet. We skip ahead to 2018, boom, Microsoft dropped $7.5 billion to acquire GitHub, arguably the largest platform where the world writes software. And I think this just really shows how Microsoft has turned around on their whole view towards open source. But if you weren't convinced already, just to add to this, I don't know if anything has topped this yet, but in 2018 as well, IBM purchased, or 2019, I think, IBM purchased Red Hat for $34 billion. And Red Hat being a company that has built itself on free and open source technology and Linux since the very beginning. So, I mean, what do all these things lead us to conclude? Well, it's no longer, people say today that open source has won. It's no longer a controversial add-on to collaborative work, and often it's expected. So as this attitude has changed, we better understand the connections between open source and innovation and transparency. More organizations, private companies, governments, and other stakeholders are really considering open source seriously. But in the open source side of things, I think the mood is kind of like the dog that caught the car. The dog that's chasing the car, but it hasn't really thought about what it's going to do if it catches that car. It's just going to chase the car. So the taste of victory is probably not quite what the free software movement envisioned almost 30, 40 years ago. And if you look around us today in 2022, we're not in some digital utopia. Free and open source hasn't made us, technologically enlightened. And lack of transparency and closed systems are still ever the norm. But it's not all bad. It's important to take account of this present moment to shape our perspective on how far we've already come and maybe how far we still have to go still. Okay, thanks for bearing through that. That was about 40 years of free and open source software history we covered in about 20 minutes. So not bad. That was a good time there. So now we're going to shift over here to the next part of today's presentation, which is actually thinking about your own steps in your own open source journey and how you can actually find a project, get involved, and make a contribution. So before we talk about contributing, first we need to bust some myths. And it's important to understand that open source is realistic for anyone to pursue. It can be tough and confusing at first if you haven't been involved in an open project or open community, but it's not as hard as it seems. And you'll find that there's different onboarding processes for different projects. Some communities do it better than others. But generally, I'll share 3 tips about finding the right project that's best for you. Before I share those tips, I just want to share a little bit of context though, of why is contributing to open source so interesting or so helpful for your career? So I think you can think of this as 5 main benefits that I like to think of for why I contribute to open source, especially from that student or studying perspective. First, you can apply the things that you're learning in your IT or computer science or design program into real world projects. You can gain experience, build your skills, and actually have something real to point to. You can also work with established projects and communities that are all used at different levels of scale. Second, is the networking and getting to meet new people and having access to travel opportunities. You can meet some of the most brilliant people from across the tech world just by working in open projects. You can learn from others and also get feedback through that process of contribution. It also gives you a chance to stay connected to opportunities for growth and new hiring opportunities. A lot of companies look to their open source projects as part of their open source talent pool for bringing in new talent to the company. But generally, you'll also see better access to these opportunities to also get mentorship for speaking at conferences. And that can sometimes mean traveling to new places to network and meet others in the industry. Third, you can also gain leadership experience. Once you break into an open source project, you may actually find some opportunities to lead on a task or a project.
Okay. I guess we lost Justin for a bit there. Let's hope he.
If not, I can read this slide.
Yeah. He's back.
Yep, guess my connection dropped there. Let me try the screen share one more time. Sorry about that. Okay, is my screen visible again?
Yep, we can see you.
Perfect. So I think when I cut off, I was just saying I was on your perspective matters as a benefit to contributing, is that technology affects us in different ways depending on your age, your race, your religion, your personal appearance, your identity, all these other things. That there's all these different factors that influence and change our perspective on how technology affects us. So open source needs more diverse voices from all kinds of backgrounds and disciplines. And fifth, and finally, I think personal friendships are also a nice benefit. You get to meet and connect with other people working on projects that are personal to you. And you can get opportunities to grow your personal network and see new diverse perspectives. This is especially true of some of the more global FOSS projects. So that was a little bit on the benefits. I mentioned I had 3 criteria to help you pick a FOSS project. So these are my pieces of advice to help guide you on finding that open source project for your journey. So first and foremost, find some project that interests you. You're allowed to be selfish. Find a project related to a topic, cause, or an issue that is interesting to you. Aligning your interest will help your motivation. You'll be more likely to succeed at a first contribution. This also assumes it's something you're doing in your spare unpaid time, so best that you're getting some kind of value out of it if you're not getting paid for it as well. One thing to avoid is using brand or clout as identifiers of an open source projects. Some projects are backed by big companies, or a project may have a reputation in some parts of the software industry. They might be doing interesting work in their field, but don't make the brand and clout the dominating factors in choosing a project. It's better to first get a foothold in a newcomer-friendly project to orient yourself in a real project that's also based on your interests. But sometimes it's a little hard to figure out where to start. So if you're not sure where to go first, start by looking around you. What are things that you use? What are apps or websites or tools, development libraries? What are dependencies that are used in software you use or make? Check and see if there's a GitHub or GitLab profiles for these things and see if those are things that you can participate with. Or think about where you want to go. look at employees of a company you want to look at and where or if their developers contribute to open source. Explore those projects. And if they're too complex for you, try to break down the skills that are needed to work on those projects and choose one to focus on and one skill to focus on, and try to find a project that can help you build up that skill. Or lastly, just things where you want to build, like you're learning a new stack, or you want to deepen your knowledge on some framework or new tool. Find open source projects working on these things and get involved, and you'll build your skill by practical experience and trial and error. So the first thing is always find something that interests you. Second is align that interest together with your experience that you already have. So explore those projects that are out there that are connected to that topic or cause or issue that's close to you. And next, compare those projects you found to your own experience and your own existing knowledge. Now, you don't have to be an expert, but it helps to know just enough to make a first step. For example, you don't want to choose a C++ program when you know nothing about C++ or lower level programming language, or picking up a design task when you don't know anything about design or testing methods. It's best to have like some basic understanding of a task. You don't have to know everything or have a perfect understanding, but just enough to dip your toes into the water. And remember, there are also more ways to participate in open source than only programming, although a project does have to be set up for some types of contributions. Open source needs designers, it needs community people, it needs marketers, it needs writers, all of these things in addition to programmers. So once you find those projects that are interesting, align it with the experience that you have and things you want to work on or grow. And finally, before you jump in, you found the super interesting project and you feel like you know enough, you could make a first step first. And finally, look at the community and jump in, evaluate what's going on in this project. You want to make sure that you choose a supportive community that's going to empower you to contribute. So how do you do this? See where the community is hanging out. Read through web forums or mailing lists, idle in chat rooms, or join group chats, or join a project meeting. All of these things are to help you get a feel for the community. And a diverse community that is inclusive for newcomers is always a positive sign. One other tip is to look out for content specifically about onboarding new contributors to a project. Maybe that's documentation or guides or blog posts, but keep an eye out if a project has gone out of their way to create newcomer documentation. So these are my 3 tips for choosing an open source project. 1, find something you care about. 2, make sure that thing you care about is a little bit tied into your personal experience and what you know. And 3rd, explore the community, get to know the people that are there, and if this is a place you'd like to work on as a project. Okay, so that's some of the tips on contributing to open source, but now to try to ground some of these things in more concrete example, we'll take a quick introduction look at the Fedora project. And I'll do my best not to steal any thunder from our next speaker today, who's going to give you a much deeper dive into these inner workings of the Fedora project. So here we just want to take a closer look at the Fedora project as an open source operating system with a global community. So Fedora, a free and open source operating system, and so much more. As the Fedora project says, they are, quote, a community of people working together to build a free and open source software platform and to collaborate on and share user-focused solutions built on that platform. Or in plain English, we make an operating system and we make it easy for you to do useful stuff with it, end quote. So Fedora is really focused on this operating system level challenge, but I like to also share the project vision and mission, just so you can get a better understanding of what Fedora is all about beyond just the technology. So Fedora's vision is that Fedora project envisions a world where everyone benefits from free and open source software built by inclusive, welcoming, and open-minded communities. So Fedora really cares that the user should be in control of their computing. But it's not enough that the software is just there waiting to be used. It has to be accessible and usable. So this vision really reflects Fedora's community approach, which is tied to some of its 4 foundations, which I'll talk about in a minute. So Fedora isn't just bits and bytes. Fedora is the people, and the leadership really cares that the vision includes a healthy community working on the Fedora project. So that's more like the high level, the big, the cloudy, or like the big picture vision. But if we break that down into how Fedora actually accomplishes that, the mission gives us better clarity into how Fedora accomplishes that vision. The Fedora mission is, quote, Fedora creates an innovative platform for hardware, clouds, and containers that enable software developers and community members to build tailored solutions for their users. So Fedora doesn't just integrate, they do new things. They are building a platform, not just a distribution. So some of the foundations that I'll talk about inspire and help drive Fedora to be innovative. Fedora does all of these things as a transparent, collaborative community and does it all as free and open source software. So I think the thing to really understand here is that not only is Fedora its own project and community and people, it's also an integration test bed for many different upstream projects that are used to build a functioning operating system. There are all kinds of technology efforts and goals and work areas all around Fedora. It's easy to see the different kinds of work streams happening side by side. And it's also helpful as a project for newcomers because you can get exposed to all these different areas of open work across software and hardware and open standards. So Fedora really comes packed with a lot of things in it. It's a really big project in a big community. But even in that community with probably, I think it's the last numbers I remember seeing is like 300 to 400 core contributors a year and up to 1,000 people who come by and make contributions during the year. What helps keep all these different people together and on the same page? You might get different answers from different people, but I think that Fedora's 4 foundations are a really huge part of what keeps the community on the same page and moving forward. So these 4 foundations: freedom, friends, features, first. And these are the common values of the community. Just like in how in 1983 with Richard Stallman and the GNU project, he launched the GNU project with a clear statement of values and what was socially important to the GNU project beyond just writing code. So you can think of that as this is kind of Fedora's own spin on that, of kind of where its values are and putting those things up front. So for freedom, that's really focusing in on Fedora's commitment to free software and content. So making sure that all the software and content developed in Fedora is shared under free and open source licenses, and choosing free alternatives to proprietary code and content whenever it's possible, or something closed source is the only option in Fedora, always trying to choose those free alternatives. The Friends Foundation, that Fedora is a strong and caring community. The Fedora community is made up of people from all walks of life, all working together to advance free software. There's a place in Fedora for anyone who wants to help, regardless of your technical skill level, as long as you believe in some of the core values of the project. Next up is features. So, these first 2 pieces are more of the conceptual and they're important, but this features part is talking about that we care about excellent software in Fedora. Fedora has created many of the technical features that have made Linux powerful and flexible and usable for millions of users, administrators, and developers. And while it'd be fine to just sit on the status quo, Fedora recognizes they also need to empower additional end users or to create a more flexible and powerful environment for new solutions that Fedora is building. And also a really important part to Fedora is this belief in working upstream. So Fedora works directly with a lot of different upstream software communities whose software gets released and distributed in Fedora. So instead of trying to do everything on their own, Fedora really has this core belief that we should work together with other people in free and open source software. And that's kind of building on that point that Fedora is an integration test bed for all these different upstream projects to come together. Finally, Fedora's fourth foundation first, that they are committed to innovation. Fedora recognizes that you can't just let everyone else do all the heavy lifting, and that you have to provide some of the latest and greatest and stable, robust, useful, and powerful free software in Fedora. So Fedora is always trying to show the future direction of the Linux operating system, whether that's on the home desktop or you're the enterprise business customer. And that 6-month release cycle helps Fedora keep on a regular pace and speed for innovating. So all these 4 foundations are a really important part of Fedora before you even land in the project, because these things really shape how and why we do what we do in Fedora. Beyond that, you'll also find there's several opportunities to develop new skills in a project like Fedora. So you can participate in the community in a number of different ways. By participating in an area you wish to grow in, you'll get to connect with industry professionals and work on real projects together. You get to learn best practices and the way in which that work happens, in addition to learning about the technology itself. Now, those skills might be on the engineering side, code, testing, operations work. It could be on the people side, open collaboration, communication, or it could be on the community front, project management, triage, outreach. So all these are different areas that you can both either build new skills that you don't have already, or that you can strengthen or build on existing skills. So just to give you an idea here of what all you can do in Fedora, I always love to show this little chart, which may already be outdated by now because things can change really quick in Fedora. But this is just to show that Fedora is a big community compared to most free software communities. When you look at this chart, there's really 4 main arms of the Linux project. And maybe Ben will talk about some of this a little bit. I'm not sure, but I'll try not to go too deep on these. But on the left side of this, you'll see there's the engineering part where you have all these different groups related, and they fit under the Fedora Engineering Steering Committee. But all these things around the different editions of Fedora, CoreOS and Silverblue, Fedora Workstation, to the package collection, to release engineering, how Fedora actually gets, how you get that ISO file every release, to working on different architectures, to containers, to gaming, and so much more. So that's all a huge part of the project. Another major part is on the Mindshare side. These are a lot of the, some of them do have engineering or technical work. A lot of these teams are less focused on the engineering side. So this might be things like the design team, which is doing UI, UX and wallpapers and graphics and the Fedora badges. It can be the ComOps team, which has the marketing and ambassadors, and the join SIG, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And as well as all these other parts, from documentation to IRC support to a websites and apps team. These all fit into the Mindshare umbrella. But we also have these 2 smaller parts, which I think are important to mention. There's the diversity and inclusion part, which is focused more on raising awareness in the community and helping recognize the different backgrounds and folks that are in our community. So a lot more on the event side, as well as the objectives. Objectives being more 12 to 18 month projects in Fedora that are trying to accomplish a specific goal. So usually you'll see these objectives usually organize work across different parts, either the engineering side and the Mindshare side, or a lot of the objectives reach into the different parts of the project. But I think that's a good way to understand the main 4 arms of Fedora and what kinds of things there are to do. And you can look at any of these smaller bubbles just to get an idea of what's out there too. So you might be feeling a little overwhelmed by looking at this, and I know I'd feel overwhelmed every time I look at this. So fortunately in Fedora, we have a super unique thing among FOSS projects, is that we have a team of people who are dedicated only to helping newcomers. And this team is called the Join Special Interest Group, or the Join SIG. So the Join SIG is available over email or forum or social media or chat rooms, and they can answer questions you have about contributing to Fedora and guide you to becoming a contributor. So Fedora is a big project. Having a mentor to help point you in the right direction at the very beginning can help save you a lot of time and set you up to make your first successful contribution. Just to give more visibility into that, you can find more about the Fedora docs team on their, or sorry, Fedora Join SIG on their docs page, where they talk about how to get involved, posting a self-introduction, kind of the general steps you go through to working with them. And that will leave us, bring us to the end of today. If there's anything else you don't take away from this, is that open source is a method, it is a movement, and it is a culture. Thank you so much for your time today. And I'm glad that I could be here and get to talk with everyone. I'm happy to take any questions or comments with the time we have left. Thanks so much. I see there's some things here in the chat. Well, maybe might be thinking on your questions. 1993 was when Red Hat was founded. So yeah, really harking on that point. Red Hat's also been a huge part of that open source story as well, all the way back to Linux in 91. Ben Cotton's got his shameless plug for his talk, which I wanted to see at DevConf in 2020, but the room was full. So I actually probably need to go back and look at that recording. Network providers are still not open. Yeah, go ahead.
I say, Justin, the version I linked there is from DevConf US, so it's a longer version of the one I gave at DevConf Czech in 2020. So it's the 40-minute version.
I got to get current. I've got something to do this Friday afternoon. Cool. Any questions from the audience or things I can cover before we wrap up?
Yep. Go ahead.
So on the security side, I remember you had said that security is one of the main benefits. I've heard from other people that while you do have more security as a project, you also have more security researchers that are trying to find vulnerabilities in the project. So does it really make it more secure to balance out? Is it less secure? I mean, what is your personal opinion about more eyes on it?
Yeah, I mean, you definitely, as a project, it's something that if you're going to be open source and you have a mindset of working in a closed project and not being very open to that kind of feedback, you're not going to have a good time. But generally, if you embrace that open way of working and really lean into that, you have it really helps you from the security perspective, because if you're working on a product that has a team of 5 developers on it, your visibility into that project is confined to those 5 people. But if you have more weight, if you're working in an open source project and you have ways for doing responsible disclosure of security vulnerabilities, that can be one way that you try to capture that activity. I know one thing Red Hat has done time to time, I don't know if they're still running them now, but they've done bug bounties. So if you find security vulnerabilities in Red Hat Enterprise Linux, you could fix it, submit a patch, and Red Hat would pay you a bounty for solving the security vulnerability and disclosing it to them, instead of saying going on the dark web or trying to do like a hack. So again, it really, I think, depends on if you're set up as a project for receiving that kind of security feedback, but also like what kind of project you're doing. Like if you're working on a little hobby project, it's obviously not going to be that important. But if you're working on something, say like bring rocket software, like things that will do like mission critical work, the approach you'll take, you can still be open source, but your pathway might look a little bit different to make sure that you're handling that feedback part and participation in your project responsibly and ethically. But generally, I think it's just a big misconception that you have more to gain by having everything out there and being in the open, having all the cards on the table, than you do by holding everything close to yourself and then being limited to however many people can see the code and whatever those people are thinking, who might have they might be biased by working on this thing for all the time. They might not see things the same way someone else would. Does that answer the question?
And I would like to add another thing on top of that. In a closed source environment, you really don't know or don't see how many people have reviewed it or things like that. In an open source, some of these core projects, sometimes they will ask you at least 2 people has to review it or 3 people has to review it, and then they will merge the code. So you can not only see what they have changed, you can also see like people reviewing it and approving those changes. So as Justin was saying, so it depends where you're working. Some of the security side of things will have more restrictions on when to merge that code, but at least there will be people reviewing them as well as thousands of eyes watching that change.
Absolutely.
Any other questions?
Any other questions or comments?
Justin, I have a question for you. You've given us a very good history of where open source came from. Where do you see the next 10 years or 20 years, and how can students contribute to that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think open source, we'll say there's the more philosophical question and then a more concrete answer. The philosophical question is that I see open source as actually having an identity crisis right now. There's a lot of people, so I mentioned briefly, there was the open source definition and the 4 freedoms that I mentioned as well. So there's a notable group of people who feel that freedom to use, that you have unlimited and unrestricted freedom to do whatever you want with the software. Some people take issue with that part of the open source definition, specifically around these things like open source software being used in projects for doing harm and for war or military intelligence. There's people who feel really uneasy about these things, and rightfully so. So we've seen in the last, I think probably like 2014 or 15, there was actually a set of new licenses that came about called ethical source licenses. They're very similar to open source, but they have language in them that restricts on that freedom of use and say that you have to, you can't the software can't be used for anything that violates the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights or those kinds of things. The challenge here is that these are a new kind of license. More projects are adopting it, but these licenses have not been proved in court or gone to the courts as much as these other tried and true open source licenses have. So I think there's a really big question of how open source is responding to the moment of today and how it will evolve as a movement to be inclusive both of, these new perspectives around how software is used, but also just keeping up with the times. Like data is this new hot topic in the last 5 years, and open source isn't really clear about that. Data is this big kind of gap on the open source side. There are licenses out there, there are organizations doing open data, but I think right now it's more of a wild west than it is anything else. So that's more of the philosophical question. I think open source has a lot to figure out in the next 10 years. On the student side of things, on where you can get involved and contribute, like for me, getting involved in free and open source projects in my university was a huge part of what helped me in my career and finding both companies that I really liked the work they were doing, and I liked working with people from those companies. Like when I work in Fedora, I work with a ton of people from Red Hat, even though I've never been a Red Hat employee, but it's given me a nice impression of working with a lot of people at Red Hat. Like people, I'd be like, oh, I'd be happy to work on a team with this group of people. So that same way that by getting involved, you can learn more about companies that are out there or that you're interested in. And you get, like I mentioned as well, on that networking side, you have better access to opportunities and new hiring opportunities that might come around from people you've worked with or in projects you've worked with. Just like I said, there's a very diverse range of players in open source, from people like the Python Software Foundation, a scrappy little nonprofit, to folks like Microsoft and IBM and Red Hat and all these other big players in open source. So I'd say really going back to those 3 tips I shared, if you can start with finding projects that are interesting to you and use those as chances to grow in terms of learning new skills and working with other people, I think that can be one of the best ways to really get a foothold in open source. Use that as a way to kind of shape your career and ultimately tie it into your own goals and what you want to do in your career. I hope that answers your question.
Yep. One more Yep, thanks, Josh. Do you want to come here? I don't know. Yeah. But I just want to add one more thing on top of what Justin said. In the last couple of decades, from calling open source to a cancer to Microsoft being one of the biggest contributor in the open source, so the trend is growing. So it's a great benefit for everyone who wants to join that trend and learn from it. Okay. Yeah.
So as you may know, recently open hardware licenses have been created and adapted to address some of the shortcomings with the traditional open source licenses applying to physical hardware. Do you think these two concepts should stay separate and sort of work on exclusively software and exclusively real things? Or do you think they should go together towards a more harmonious concept that covers all of those?
That is a great question. And if I can just say, I am a huge fan of the CERN open hardware licenses version 2, because you have all those same different flavors of licenses from the strict copyleft to permissive. But I think just by nature of seeing the things I see in Fedora, software and hardware are different. They have they're different domains and areas of knowledge, but can you really have hardware without software? And can you really have software without hardware? Like, I think these things are so integrally tied together that to me, I can't see us putting them so far apart. I think they have to have room to be different because they do have their differences in how you build and share. Like, you can't do unit testing and quality assurance the same way for hardware as you would for software, right? So there are some key differences you have to respect around how you approach those, but generally the philosophical grounds of these licenses and the kind of ways you apply them, I think are definitely relevant, and they should be close together because the open hardware licenses those have come about because of the open source legacy and the 20, 30 years of open source software that preceded open hardware becoming more well-known and more mainstream. So I think you have to combine them together in some way, maybe more on the philosophical or conceptual part, and just making sure that they have enough room to do their own things, their own software specific and hardware specific things in their own ways. I hope that answers the question, but definitely a very exciting area right now. I've been working with some hardware projects around drones, and it's just been really, really exciting to see that space starting to grow and more momentum going there.
And I want to see RISC-V widely available. So I'm also on the same page. I want to see more of RISC-V architectures out there and trying to see if all the Fedora and the distributions work on them and see it grow. Any other questions?
So probably.
Yeah. It's not about the personal, it's not about the person, it's just how they are contributing and how much, what are they contributing? They will look at the code quality. Let's say if it is a code quality and if both came up with a different solution, again, there are like thousands of eyes watching that project, and people, will pick which one they think is the best. Okay, I guess.
All right. Well, if that is it for questions, then we can go ahead and transition over to the next speaker here. Thanks so much for inviting me out here today, and glad I got to spend this hour with you all talking on open source. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks a lot. So I want to see if our next, Ben is already here. So Ben, you wanna, we can start, and we can have 5 more minutes before you leave.
Yep.
So I want
and the good news is my 5 o'clock or my 1 o'clock meeting got canceled, so I actually do have time to hang around longer if we need to. So.
Just one quick update before we start. There is pizza, guys, if you want to go and help yourself, and that would be great. And we'll have more time after the talks. We can discuss any other questions you have. We can discuss after that. The next presentation is by Ben Cotton. He's a program manager for Fedora. And again, I've been working with him for so many years. And the presentation is about how Fedora is run and why. Ben, you want to take over?
All right, thanks, Mohan. Really appreciate everyone being here. Appreciate the invitation. And thank you to Justin for covering a bunch of things that I had actually, some of the things I literally put in my slides yesterday. So that works out well. So I'd like to get started with a little bit of housekeeping. I use he, him pronouns. This talk is under an open content license. I do ask that we keep questions at the end because there's a lot of stuff I want to get through. But I have my email address here on the screen if you have questions that you want to follow up with later. And I want to throw out a couple of disclaimers real quick. Number one, this is a very highly compressed talk. It's a very lossy compression algorithm. I'm going to skip over a lot of very important details that I could probably talk about for days. So, if you do have more detailed questions afterwards, I'd be happy to answer them. But, understand that we're glossing over a lot here. And I also want to make clear that this is how Fedora works. Not all open source projects work this way, and not even all Linux distributions work this way. It's not necessarily the right way. There are definitely things in Fedora that I would change, especially if we were starting from day one. But this is how it is, and it generally works well for us. So to start off, what is Fedora? Justin already shared our vision statement with you, but at a grand idea that ties us all together is that we want people to be able to benefit from the computing. We want them to own it, and we want to work on it collaboratively. Justin was instrumental in helping get Fedora Linux be the first Linux distribution to be a digital public good. And we really take that seriously. This is a thing that we're all building together for each other. And it's apparently in there twice. So cool. So Fedora is a community. And there are really sort of three groups of people that we, for the most part, are treated the same, but just so you understand where the contributors come from. There are people who are not Red Hat employees. They're contributing either because it's interesting and fun to them, and that's how I got started. Or maybe they're contributing because they work for somebody else who has an interest in them making contributions to Fedora. There are people who are Red Hat employees working in Fedora as part of their day job. So a lot of times these are engineers who are maintaining packages in Fedora as the upstream for Red Hat Enterprise Linux. But there are also Red Hat employees who are working in Fedora outside of their day job. Like they happen to be Red Hat employees, but their contributions are because they want to, not because it's their job. But also, it's not really accurate to call Fedora a community. In a lot of ways, we're a group of communities. There's a lot of autonomy in open source projects, and Fedora is no different. You have people who, maybe come to work on some of the graphic design, but that's it, and they don't really participate outside of that. Or like they work on documentation, or they work on packaging. They have a very specific thing they want to work on, and they're active in that team, but they don't necessarily participate in some of the broader discussion. That seems particularly true of our translations teams, because a lot of times they don't necessarily have a ton of interest in like the technical aspects, but they are able to translate documentation and software into their native tongue, which is an incredibly valuable skill, especially as we want to make computing globally accessible. In most open source projects, English is the default language, but not everyone speaks English or speaks it well. So being able to use your computer in your own native language is really important. So generally, we're more like a school of fish, and we're all heading sort of in the same direction, but sometimes some of the fish kind of do fishy things. Why is this here again? Oh no, this is supposed to say mission statement. So yeah, so we're a community. What do? We don't just hang out with each other, although we do enjoy doing that. So we produce a variety of deliverables. These are the bits that you download and install on your computer. And we have a concept of editions, and these are sort of our showcase offerings. And they're each targeted at specific market segments, let's call it. So Fedora Server for servers, Fedora Workstation for desktop, laptop usage, and Fedora IoT for embedded and edge devices. We also have what we unofficially call emerging editions, which are things that aren't quite editions yet, but they are exciting new areas of technology. So Fedora CoreOS provides immutable, the developer doesn't like that word, but like a reprovisionable platform with basically using the operating system as a Git file system analogy to make it really safe to do upgrades and rollbacks. And so Fedora CoreOS is really targeted at being able to run containerized workloads like Kubernetes. Fedora Silverblue is the same concept, but for desktop. So, your applications are all sort of sandboxed from the OS. The OS can be updated and then rolled back very trivially if there's an issue. But we don't just produce those. We also have tons of things that we historically have called spins and labs that showcase different desktop environments. There are, I don't know, dozens of different desktop environments in the Linux ecosystem with a varying popularity that do different things. Sometimes a desktop environment will do a big redesign that some people just don't like, so they'll fork the old version and maintain it under a new name. But we also have people who are developing versions of Fedora Linux for specific use cases like astronomy or teaching Python in the classroom or doing robotics. And the community can come in and basically curate the package set and the defaults and build this within the Fedora project infrastructure. And we ship that as part of our releases. So you might be familiar with some other Linux operating systems that are sort of under Red Hat's umbrella. So we really have an ecosystem in flow. So Fedora Linux is the cutting edge, like Justin talked about. First we're incorporating things from upstream projects pretty rapidly. We have a quick release cycle that I'll talk about here in a little bit. So we're really sort of advancing the state of the technology. Every 3 years, Red Hat forks Fedora and says, all right, from this point on, we're going to copy this over into CentOS Stream. And that's basically where people can use what will become the next Red Hat Enterprise Linux. So it's sort of a stabilization ground for RHEL, which is the product that Red Hat sells to fund all this work that's given away for free. And that's really for enterprises who need a stable and supported operating system with a multi-years up to a decade, I think, life cycle. So how do we run the community? Justin shared the org chart, so I won't go into this, but there are a lot of different ways to be involved. In fact, sometimes people will ask, like, what can I do in Fedora? And I say, think of something that would be a job in a software company, and we probably have that. With the exception of like payroll, that's really the only thing I can't think of a good analogy for, but all open source projects not only need coders, but they need testers, documentation writers, people to do marketing and social media, websites, all that kind of stuff. And so, and those non-technical, well, I don't want to say non-technical, those non-engineering aspects of open source projects are often the areas that the projects need the most help. And things like documentation are a great way to get started in a project, even if you do want to start coding, because you have to be able to, you're going through and sort of verifying the documentation, filling in the gaps. There are always gaps. So you're learning your way around the software and the code base as you're producing something useful. So it's a really good win-win situation. So, but unlike a company, Fedora doesn't have like this, tiered structure. It's not like, the executive suite and, upper management, middle managers, things like that, where it's a very pure, flat sort of structure. But we do have a little bit of a hierarchy just to sort of provide guidance. So at the top level, we have the Fedora Council, and it basically sets the project-wide goals. It governs the finances and trademarks and things like that. If there are disputes that can't be resolved, basically the council is the Supreme Court of that. So the council will sort of arbitrate. Thankfully, that doesn't happen very often because that's never fun. But the way the council works is we make decisions on a consensus model. So basically, if there's somebody on the council that is opposed to something, it doesn't happen, which is frustrating. But it also, because there are somewhere between 7 to 10 members of the council at any time, and 1,000 or more people in the project, we want to be very careful about not just letting a few people just take the project in a direction that the community doesn't want to go. And so the idea is, if we can't convince somebody that our idea is good, then maybe we need to work on either the idea itself or how we're messaging it. So I talked about the members. We have a Fedora project leader, and the little hat there indicates that they are hired by Red Hat to be in that role. And they are sort of the, they are liaison to Red Hat, and also sort of the figurehead, the face of the project to the media and things like that. The Fedora project leader, unlike some other open source projects, doesn't have like a dictatorial ability to get anything done. There are a few things under his control, but primarily he has to, lead by getting buy-in and influence in the community. We also have a community action and impact coordinator, which we call FCAKE, because that's a really long term. And other communities might call us a community manager or community architect. This role, again, is hired by Red Hat and does the work of at least 3 or 4 people. She's in charge of, a lot of the non-engineering work, and running some of the community events and basically the health and well-being of the community moving forward. We do elect 2 members from the community at large. Everyone who's a member of the Fedora community can vote and can run. They serve 1-year alternating terms. Justin mentioned our objectives. So these are sort of project spanning year to year and a half kind of efforts. And they get a seat on the council basically as a way to, one, help give them some leverage in other parts of the project. And they can say, hey, we need this for our objective. And that's often a good way to get a little more priority on something, especially from some of the support that Red Hat provides. We have representatives from the engineering and mindshare committees, which I'll talk about more in a moment. The Fedora program manager, which is me. My responsibilities include managing our changes process, setting our schedule, running the elections, basically out of the day-to-day operational stuff that gets the releases out the door every 6 months. And then we have a diversity and inclusion team, which is now diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think they've officially changed. And that representative is on the Fedora Council because we wanted to make it clear that this is a council and a project level priority. We didn't want to bury it, under the Mindshare committee or something like that. The open source in general has a real diversity problem. And while Fedora is no different, we do recognize that and we want to address it and fix that going forward. So I talked about the engineering steering committee. They basically provide the technical oversight for the function of building and releasing the operating system. So they do technical changes, approve the schedule, things like that. And it's entirely elected by the community body. So, there's no secret Red Hat sauce or, somebody paid to be on there. A lot of the FESCO members tend to be Red Hat employees because they are very active in the community. And one thing I've learned about the elections is that a lot of it is a name recognition thing. But it's there to represent the voice of the community as a whole in the technical decisions. Similarly, we have a Mindshare committee, which covers basically all of the non-engineering things like websites, design, basically all the outreach and community oversight. They elect 2 members, and then 7 are selected from the teams that make up the Mindshare side of the house. So for example, the design team would have a representative on the Mindshare committee to represent the interests of the design team as a whole. And the Mindshare committee does things like funding events and scholarship for traveling to conferences and things like that. And then the FCAIC also serves on the Mindshare committee. The diversity, equity, and inclusion team does what it sounds like. Like I said, it reports directly to the Fedora Council, and it's there. They run Fedora Week of Diversity and other events. We used to do a Fedora Women's Day, but expanded that. And they also provide guidance and input to the rest of the community to help make sure we're being more inclusive. And I have to talk about Red Hat and therefore IBM, which, as Justin said, bought Red Hat a few years ago. Red Hat provides financial and material sponsorship. They give us money. They pay for people to work on stuff. They pay for our infrastructure, but they're generally hands-off. It's very popular on social media and certain websites. Whenever Fedora makes a decision that people don't like, it's, Red Hat is doing this evil thing and IBM is making them do it. But in reality, the influence that Red Hat has comes from Red Hat employees who are participating in the project. And sometimes we do things that they don't like. So for example, in Fedora Linux 33, we switched the default file system for most of our deliverables to Btrfs. Red Hat pays 0 people to work on Btrfs. And so they weren't entirely thrilled about that. But also, the Fedora community decided, and we have people willing to, be maintainers of Btrfs in Fedora. So even though Red Hat didn't like it, we made that switch. Which leads into how we do the technical changes in each release. We have a process called the changes process. It's just a way of managing features. We used to have a process called the features process, which is why we picked a different name. But the goals are really about communication, coordination, accountability. It's not there to gatekeep. It's really, one, to make sure that everyone knows what's going on, and so nobody is unpleasantly surprised. To make sure we're not trying to do 2 different things that are incompatible with each other, and to get feedback. One of the things we're getting feedback on right now is a proposal to drop support for BIOS booting, basically to deprecate it. A lot of people still use that, especially on older hardware. Some of the feedback has been very strong. And the person who proposed that will take that into account, and the change may or may not be approved. So what happens is we have a template that people fill out that gives some basic information. What do you want to do? Why do you want to do it? What's the impact? They submit it. I send it to the mailing list. It gets at least a week of community comment. And I think that's one thing people don't always understand. They see that change proposal go out and they say, oh, Fedora has decided to do this. And no, we haven't. Somebody is proposing that we do this. And the feedback period works. A few years ago, there was one of the issues we have is it's really hard to measure how many people are running Fedora Linux in a way that respects privacy, which is very important to us. So somebody proposed an idea that would basically generate a unique ID and just use that when checking for the repositories for updates. And even though I think it was probably pretty sound from a privacy perspective, a lot of people were concerned that, maybe it could be sort of reverse engineered, or could accidentally leak information. And so that proposal was changed dramatically and done in a way that was much less concerning to people who are strong privacy advocates. So the community comment period is really important. And I think it's one of the useful things that we do for transparency. After the comment period is over, it goes to FESCO, who will either approve it or ask for more information or sometimes reject it. Once a change is approved, we have these contingency deadlines built into the schedule. And basically like, hey, is this done? If it's not, we may decide to move it out to the next release. And that's just a way to try and make sure we're not still trying to do development, right before a release. So what does the release schedule look like? Well, we have a life cycle. We plan for major releases every April and October. We don't do minor releases or official respins. So for better or for worse, the ISO that you download a week before the next release is the one that was published, 5.5 months ago. There is a team within the community that does unofficial respins to get newer packages, but it doesn't go through the same QA process that our official releases do. And then the releases are only supported for basically about 13 months. And that's just sort of a trade-off where we want to be fast moving and we want to do new features. On the other hand, since we rely heavily on volunteer effort, it's hard to tell people you must support this for like 5 years. People would not commit to that. And so, just being respectful of people's resources, the longer the software is out there, the harder it becomes to backport security fixes and things like that. So this is the balance we strike. We no longer do an alpha release. Alphas are of less value generally these days. It's a lot easier to just get, the state of software at any given point. Now that a lot of people have fast internet connections, you don't have to produce those CD images. But we still do a beta release 5 weeks before the final release to give some extra like real world testing for people who want to help make sure that what we're going to ship is useful. And we do have a rolling development stream we call Fedora Rawhide. And that's basically where all the really disruptive changes go. Some people actually run that on their desktop. Mohan is one of those. I've not quite gotten myself to that point yet, but it's really like the leading edge of what the next Fedora Linux will look like. So I talked about QA a little bit. We have a concept of blockers and freeze exceptions. So we put that freeze in place to give QA something to test against, a stable target. But not all of our deliverables are release blocking because we don't have the resources to test and fix every bug. So we have a set of release criteria that define the requirements that we expect the software to do or not do. If something violates that, it stops the release unless we come up with an exception for it, which is pretty rare. And so the community does weekly meetings to review the blockers and vote. We vote asynchronously in tickets. That just allows everyone to get some feedback. Not all blockers are very obvious decisions. Sometimes it's, well, what is the meaning of basic functionality for this application? Do we really want to block because you can't do this thing that requires 10 different steps that nobody will actually know unless they're trying to break the software, that kind of thing. But we do for things that aren't blockers but are important to fix, especially if they'll go on the live installer that people will use. We will allow those fixes to go through if they're ready. We just won't stop the release on it. And then we have a prioritized bug process for fixing things that are important but don't rise to the level of release blockers. And generally, those are things that are bugs in already released software. So every 6 months, right before the release, we get together and we have a go, no go decision. We check to make sure all the blockers are resolved or waived. We have that there's a release candidate and that it's actually been tested. So we have all these test cases that our QA team runs through to make sure, like, does this actually work? If it's not, we'll push it back a week. And then if there's something missing that isn't one of our blocking images, we don't rerun the compose. That's less of a problem than it used to be. Nowadays, most of the time, if something didn't build, it's because there's a problem with a package or something. It's not just a network hiccup. Back a few years ago, there were a lot more that were failing for that, and so it often involved some extra effort by Mohan and by the website's team to like copy them out into unofficial locations and then set up the links there, just so that because we don't do a respin, if the Python classroom lab didn't build for a particular release, it just wouldn't ever be available. And so we wanted to try and work around that as best as possible. So that's the end of the prepared content. I have now plenty of time for questions, so I would be happy to address anything you want to know about the Fedora project or open source in general, or breakfast foods. I have strong opinions about those.
Yeah, if you are a user of Fedora and if you see an issue and if it is not getting resolved, just ping Ben Cotton in there and he will get it fixed. He's the guy. Any questions? I just want to mention, go ahead. You want to?
I just wanted to see some use cases of Fedora, like how it would be used. Like there were a couple of examples, like you're using in an astronomical.
Yeah. I don't know if I can show some of the use cases right now. Ben, do you know any of those labs and other things that are being run anywhere?
So I know the Python Classroom Lab gets used by one of our contributors sometimes. He's in the Czech Republic, and he actually does use it to teach Python to students. A lot of times they use it. Most of our variants have a live image, so you can boot them up and run them without having to install it to the hard drive. So that works really well in, a computer lab where you can't modify the computer, but you could, boot off this image and get the right environment. I know there is I forget the name of it now. There's a public museum/library in Prague that uses Fedora for all of their kiosks. So for patrons walk in, they need to use the computer. It's Fedora, I think Fedora Workstation is what they're using. Fedora IoT gets used. There are some, I think, oil companies that are using it for a lot of their control systems and stuff in various plants.
And Fedora OS, if you go to any of the cloud services, you can see it's one of the distribution that you can run on it on the any of the virtual cloud providers. And also, I'm trying to work with Professor Vinod here to see more traction on the robotics lab and probably get it more usage and probably teach robotics on that particular distribution. And also the networking side of things, like security. Yeah, so I just, I guess last week itself, I showed Professor Vinod Okrane here about the security lab that we have and see if we can incorporate into the teaching sites at UMass level itself. So probably you will see more of those use cases in the near future. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know it's maybe been a year or so, but one of our contributors wrote an article for Fedora magazine about how he uses the astronomy lab to do nighttime photography, some of the telescope controls and the photo processing. So if you go to fedoramagazine.org and search some of the archives, you'll be able to see those articles as well.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah. Definitely. And if you're interested in those set of things, like on the automotive side, we also have something going on over there as well. And I know that some of, I'm not sure this is entirely because we don't keep track of like who's using what. We cannot do that. But I heard some people are using Fedora IoT to, on a heavy machinery, trying to capture all the data results and see if trying to do analysis and things like that. Yeah.
To that point, this is probably one of the reasons we have the club. If you have an interesting thrust area that you think needs more attention, we could put up as a project and we could find more developers to kind of get it to actual product. And that as a club, we could do that.
Yeah.
We could fund stuff, projects, summer projects, stuff like that. So that's the whole idea. And I did look at the security lab. A lot of good software already packaged. On my network design class, I do use Wireshark and all the packet sniffing software, but the security lab goes one step forward in terms of having a comprehensive collection of person in the middle attack, different types of brute force attacks. So you can actually get all those use cases and test it on a system. So it's a very good experience for students to learn and see what kind of attack scenarios are coming in. And I plan to include that in my summer security course. Yeah.
And I just want to mention something else here, as Ben was showing the council part. It's the governance body. At the same time, in FESCO, which is called Fedora Engineering and Steering Committee, is the engineering side of those things. The governance body itself doesn't. There are representatives from the steering committee, engineering steering committee, but any other role in that council doesn't require any programming or engineering skills. You can be coming from documentation, or you are a test, as Ben was in QA, in documentation, and that's how he got into Fedora. So, and now he's a program manager. I'm definitely sure he has some programming experience and things like that, but he was in documentation. So you can be coming from different field, and you can still contribute to Fedora and any of the other open source projects out there.
And say, in fact, no open source project ever says we have enough people. There's always more work to do than people to do it. And that's true for the programming side as well. But, I think most open source projects really are lacking in the non-programming areas. I talked about marketing and web design, outreach, just being able to go to conferences or go to clubs and talk to people about the software, about the project in ways that are meaningful to them. We don't make, like, computers don't exist to have computers. They exist to, for us to do cool things on them. And I think a lot of times open source projects sometimes get lost, the messaging gets lost, and they talk about, look how cool our technology is, and not look what cool things you can do with the technology.
Any other questions? Thanks, Ben. Thanks a lot for the presentation.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, so I guess that's pretty much it. But I just want to say something here. So we just started this club. We are looking for volunteers and also members of for the club. And we are here from the Red Hat side to help you do whatever you want, as long as it's open source. And as Professor Wakaran is saying, like we are happy to fund some of those stuff as well. And yeah, hope to see more people joining this club, and hope to see more and more awesome projects being developed over here. And I will try to organize some of these sessions, like be some training sessions or some talks like this. So that will be interesting for you guys. And probably have some more events, coding camps and other things. So please spread the word, and hope to see more people joining the club, and hope to see more and projects being developed here. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yep. Thanks, guys. Please help for yourself some more pizza, and thanks everyone for joining. Yeah.
So yes,